Hi, Ben Pittman here with some of the furniture sites you've been looking at, which is probably where you found this video. I am not a professional painter. However, I own a company that does professional painting, and I have some of the best painters you can possibly think of in the Myrtle Beach area. But what I want to do today is just share with you some important tips and points if you're going to paint yourself. Now, a lot of people like do-it-yourself painting, and I think that's great. But if you're going to paint for yourself, then here's some things that I picked up from an article I read that I think were very important. So I just decided I wanted to expound on it a little bit on this video so you could have some ideas, not from a professional painter, but from somebody who really understands painting, being in the painting business. I've actually owned a factory that painted a lot of different substrates many years ago, so I became very familiar with how to do some of this stuff, even though I don't do it every day myself. So let me tell you a few things about painting that you might not have thought about before. First of all, painting is not as easy as it looks. And a lot of people think, well, you know, I can just get me a roller and a pan and some paint and I can just have at it and do a good time. But that's really makes it look so simple. And some of the stuff they do on television with some of the spray-ons and things like that, they just make it look so simple and so enticing to just jump in there on Saturday morning and do it. But here's some of the things that you really want to watch out for if you're going to do it yourself and not hire a professional painter. I'm not advocating hiring a professional painter. I'm just simply saying watch out for these things. And if you do hire a professional painter, then you want to make sure they do these things, but they probably will if they're good at what they do. First of all, don't skimp on the prep work. The prep work is very, very, very important if you're going to have a good paint job. Now, you're going to spend a lot of time prep work. I'm talking about filling all the holes. You can't fill a hole all at one time necessarily. You got to fill a little bit, let it dry, fill a little bit, let it dry, and let it get bigger than the hole, and then turn around and sand off the excess when you fill the hole. That's just one idea that you need to really pay attention to. Make sure that is a very smooth surface before you ever start painting. Second of all, you want to make sure that you dust everything and clean everything. Clean the corners of the windows, go down there and dust the baseboards, you know, vacuum the floor even if you want to, because you want to get all the dust that you possibly can out of the area. And just do your prep work. If you're taking off old paint, which we're going to talk about a little bit more, make sure you take it off and sand it down properly, or get the surface smooth and ready to paint, because your prep work is going to make all the difference in the world as to how your paint job comes out. I used to refinish furniture, and it was very, very important to get all the old finish off of the furniture before you started putting new finish on. Same thing with paint, even though you think, well, that's a different color, it'll cover everything up. No, it won't. It'll make it look worse. So make sure you do good prep work when you start to paint. Second of all, don't mess with old paint unless you know what you're doing. Now, lead-based paint was outlawed in America in 1978, I think it was, somewhere along in that area. And if you want to know more about lead-based paint, then you can go to, it says right here, go to epa.gov/LEAD. So go to www.epa.gov/LEAD, and it'll tell you everything you need to know about what to do with lead-based paints. But the main thing is you don't want to scrape and be sanding lead-based paint, because that makes all those particles become friable. F-R-I-A-B-L-E. Friable means airborne. And then when they become airborne, it means you can breathe them in and get them into your system. And that's the thing you just really don't want to think about when you're doing all this kind of stuff. So make sure, even today, as long as it's been since 1978, that you're not dealing with something that has lead-based paint in it. If you're dealing with old houses and things like that, chances are you may have some lead-based paint. Be careful. Don't paint over moisture or active mold. Now, this is also very important. You've got to stop the moisture problem, whatever it is, before you paint. You do not want to paint over moisture. You've also got to stop the active mold growth. And if you can, and you need to wash the mold off, but you got to stop the mold growth first. Now, they have products out there that they say will cover over mold stains and things like that, and it'll cover it. But believe you me, in a short period of time, it'll come back if you don't possibly get rid of that mold. So get rid of the moisture. That will get rid of the mold before you ever start painting. That is essential to think about. And once you've got it dry and once you've got it mold free, then you can use the cover-up materials to cover up the stain, because you've solved the problem. Then you can sand it and paint it and you'll be okay. But make sure you get rid of that. Don't paint masonry. Masonry has real porous surfaces, and so you've got to fill those porous areas, and make sure you fill all the way to the bottom of the pour and let it dry from the inside out, and then sand it off before you start to paint masonry surfaces. It takes a lot of prep work to paint masonry, so be very careful about painting masonry unless you really do the good prep work that needs to be done. Prep work is essential in all these things. Don't use tape unless you use the right kind of tape. Now, some people say, well, I'll just take some masking tape or some good old duct tape, which we use for everything, and just go ahead and duct tape it off or mask tape it off. No, don't do that, because the paint's going to bleed underneath the tape. It could even jerk part of the gypsum cover off of the surface whenever you do that, and you just don't want that to happen. So get you some, if you're going to use tape, which is perfectly okay, just get the best kind of painter's tape. Spend a little bit more money. Do not use masking tape, and do not use duct tape. Use real painter's tape, or don't use tape at all. Best advice I can possibly give you. Don't use cheap paint. Now, why? Well, unless you find it on sale. Now, I got some Sherwin-Williams paint the other day. It was 30% off. Boy, that was a deal, and I really liked it, but it was Sherwin-Williams. I knew it was a good quality paint, and I just waited for the sale to come, and when the sale hit, man, I jerked about 20 gallons of it out of Sherwin-Williams in a hurry to paint some stuff in a couple of condos I had. So I can see that part of it, and I'm not advocating Sherwin-Williams. There are other good paints out there, but you don't need the most expensive paint, but you don't need the cheapest paint either. So be careful about buying cheap paint thinking you're saving money, because you still got you still got a bunch of money tied up in the prep time, whether you do it or somebody else does it. You've got money tied up in the labor to do the painting. Spending $5 or $10 more for a better brand of paint is nothing compared to all the time and effort and the total cost you've got in doing the job. Plus, you don't want it to look bad 2 or 3 years later, and after you just painted it, you want this paint job to last a few years, not just a year or two. Okay? The other thing is, don't use cheap paintbrushes. Cheap paintbrushes are cheap because they have either inferior bristles or they have less bristles. Either way, they'll put paint marks in your paint. Looks good when you put it up there, but 2 or 3 days later, man, you could kill yourself for not having a better paintbrush, when the paintbrush was just a little bit more expensive for a good paintbrush. And these paintbrushes will last a long time, especially the good ones. You can wash them out and use them over and over and over again if you take good care of them. The cheap paintbrush, you say, well, I'm just going to paint it and throw it away. Well, you're killing 2 things there. Number one, you're losing the ability to use it again. And number 2, you're going to get a poor job. So don't use cheap paintbrushes. And the same thing goes for rollers. Don't use cheap rollers. If you're going to use a roller, use a good roller. Our professional painters use the best roller they can use, the ones they can wash out and use over and over and over again. They use lambskin, as a matter of fact. I think that's what it is. And because they say they can get such a much smoother job. And this doesn't show up until either the end of the job. When you start using those cheap rollers, they start wearing out towards the end of the job, and I guarantee you will not know when to switch one over. So right in the middle, you go ahead and put a new roller in. Well, right before you switch that roller over with that cheap roller, and right after you switch over, you'll see a big difference in how rough the surface is and all this kind of stuff. So don't use cheap rollers, just like you don't use cheap paintbrushes. Now, I'm also not saying you got to use lamb's wool if you're not a professional painter, but just be careful and use the rollers and change them often so you get a real smooth finish throughout your entire paint job. Don't paint your window tracks. Now, this is pretty obvious, but just think about it. Don't paint your window tracks. You're going to get your paint all gommed up, all in your window tracks. The windows are not going to work right. You're going to be very frustrated. So just take the time to paint, all around the window tracks, but do not paint the window tracks. Now, the other thing is you don't want to paint your electrical switch plates, and you don't want any of those switch plates. First of all, you need to remove those switch plates before you paint in the first place, and not be painting around them, make them look bad. Because now, let's go back to what we talked about substrates. Substrates are things like glass, metal, plastic, and wood, and also gypsum. Okay, so those are 5 examples of substrates. If you're going to paint, each substrate requires a different kind of a primer, and these primers are things that you have to prepare the surface with. So I'm going to talk about priming. If you're going to paint a different kind of a substrate, let's just say you're painting gypsum on the wall, you can't use the same paint on a switch plate, because unless you put some kind of a primer on the switch plate. So if you're going to paint it, take it off. And the other thing is, if you're going to paint something like a different kind of a surface with a different kind of paint, make sure that you get the substrate prepared properly, because what you want to see happen is you want to see this chemical bond between the substrate and the primer, that you want to make sure that chemical bond is okay, and that becomes your chemical bond between the primer and the paint. So you got 3 steps there. If you try to put paint right on top of that substrate, it's going to just lay there and not bond to the surface, and it'll peel and crack and all kinds of crazy stuff. So that's where you get into problems when you don't prime it properly. The perfect example is a switch cover. That's a small example, but it's a perfect example. Go ahead and just either spend the extra time if you want to getting those switch plates primed before you paint them, or what I'd suggest do, go out and buy a different kind of switch plate. Just buy a different color and put it up there and make it blend in with what you're painting on the wall. Even a contrasting color will look better than you trying to paint the switch plate, because it is a different substrate. Now, all these tips and techniques are things that I think you ought to think about if you're going to become your own painter, and I don't see anything wrong with doing that. I'm just simply saying, if you're going to go ahead and paint for yourself, be sure and follow these instructions. And if you hire a professional painter, once again, I told you this already, be sure that they follow these same instructions. And if they're a good painter, they probably, I'm sure they will anyway. This is Ben Pittman, and thank you so much for watching this little video. And I just did this as part of the furniture branding, local furniture branding program that we put on the internet. So thank you so much, and we look forward to talking to you about something else later.